thanks very much. I'd like to introduce Bill Bryce here. Bill Bryce is the ultimate enthusiast. He's raced bikes. He is a bike mechanic. He has ridden around Australia on flathead Harley Davidsons, and I like the way Bill actually just took his Harley for a quick run down to Canberra and back just to make sure it was working okay. That's the sort of rider that Bill is. Probably done more miles on old bikes than anybody that I know. Very successful racer, mechanic, and he's doing a little talk here on just what to do when you store a bike so that when you pull it out, it'll actually work. So I'll just hand over to Bill.
Always. I think this is going. Morning, everyone. Yeah, I work at Old Gold Motorcycles, and we import a lot of bikes from Japan. I think we brought in about 60 containers with about 30 bikes in each. So part of my job is to get them going, and apart from local bikes that we pick up, but I've seen all sorts of well-prepared bikes and poorly prepared bikes, and the difference between getting them going is like a couple of hours and sort of 3 or 4 days work. So it's fairly important to put them away properly. And there's not much involved really, but I'll just start by one important thing is to wash them thoroughly, because you get so much road grime and acids from the rains coming down, lands on your chrome, and that all needs to be cleaned off thoroughly. And it's even on new bikes very important, because I know that Honda, when they're looking at warranty claims for corroded chrome, paint, zinc, cad, they always look to see if the customer's been keeping it clean and polished. And of course, if it's clean and polished, it won't rust. So they knock back all those claims. So that's really important. The other thing is, before you put a bike in the storage, you should always change the oil, because the old oil you've been running on, byproducts of combustion, you get build up of corrosion. The oil is actually meant to clean all the crap out of your oil, and it gets caught up in the oil. And water is also a byproduct of combustion, so that water lays in that thing the whole time if you've got it in storage. And I've had pulled gears out and from unit construction engines with a gearbox involved, or crankshafts, and if they've been sitting for a long time, you'll see a layer of rust and deep pits at one level where the oil has held corrosive elements in it. So it's really important to change that oil, put nice fresh oil in it before you put it away. Some people like to store bikes on with a trickle charger on the battery. I would take a battery out of the motorcycle every time. If you want to keep your battery on a trickle charger, fine, but I'd keep it separate from the motorcycle. So, and as I say, the bikes that we look at work have been stored from like 1 year to 20 years. So I've sort of seen a big range. Now, I was reading an article recently by a bearing manufacturer, and they say that the wheel bearings on motorcycles and steering head bearings can actually be damaged by just sitting. They said that they could actually put minuscule dents in the bearing races by sitting. I find it a bit hard to believe, but they're the bearing manufacturer and they're warning against it. So good advice would be to take the weight off the suspension, take the weight off all the shock rubbers, and just support it by the frame so you haven't got the weight on there. I wouldn't be that concerned about tyres unless you're only storing it for 1 or 2 years, because quite often the bikes that we get, the tyres are just rotten and split, and if you pump them up, they'll burst, and we've had a couple burst because that's how rotten they are. So, and let's face it, riding on old tyres is foolish anyway, because they're the only thing keeping you off the asphalt. So I'm never that concerned about tyres, and every bike we bring in, we always put new tyres on anyway. So. You'd be surprised how many bikes we get that have had vermin attacked. For some reason, Yamaha in particular, rats and mice, love the rubbers on Yamahas. A few other Jap bikes as well, but you'll see them sometimes in the hand grips and some of the rubber components around the inlet ducts, around the airbox, have got these great deep gouges in them, and it's the vermin, the mice have been eating the rubber, and you can see the tooth marks in them, but sometimes the grips are completely wrecked. Wiring, quite often they'll strip the insulation off the wiring. Now, there's not much you can do about the wiring, but handlebar grips and corrosion and moisture getting into the switch blocks is a problem. So I'd be putting plastic bags, Ziploc bags over the things and taping them up or something like that. Just keep the moisture out of the switches, because quite often you get a bike started and running and then the switches don't work because you've got the little bit of corrosion on all those open metal parts in there, and then they don't work. Sometimes a bit of flicking they'll go, but other times you've got to strip and clean them. And so I reckon seal them off, plastic bags, take them off, and it'll save a lot of heartache later on and protect your grips, I suspect. Your big problem is petrol. Petrol in the tank, petrol in the fuel lines, petrol in the fuel tap, and the carburetors in the carbies. It's by far the biggest problem. And the fuel we've got today is crap, and it goes off so quickly. And in fact, on some of the little Hondas 250 4-cylinders, the pilot jets on them are only about 11, 12 thou, and it only takes a fortnight for some of that fuel to go off of those pilot jets, and then you've got to pull them out and clean them. Other bikes, with bigger bikes too, we found sometimes if you don't start it for 3 weeks, it won't start, it won't fire. You just drain the 4 bowls, let fresh fuel come down, boom, it'll go instantly. So if you ever have trouble starting your bike, just try doing that. Just bring that fresh fuel down, and it makes a big difference. Now, who's ever heard of putting a bike into storage and filling the fuel tank right up with fuel so the air can't get in? Do you think that's a good idea? That's petrol. That's petrol. That's what it goes like these days. I cleaned that out of a bike that had been stored for 15 years, and the whole tank was full of that. Yeah, it stinks, and it gets in the pores of your clothes, gets in your pores your skin and your clothes. Ugh, it's horrible stuff. But that's what fuel goes like now. This modern fuel ends up like that. So the best thing you can do by far is drain your tank, and we get a lot of bikes come in that they've drained in Japan, but there's a little trickle around the fuel tap, and then they put the bike onto the side stand, and that fuel gets into the tap, clogs up the fuel tap. Then invariably the rubbers in there shrink. You can't retrieve them, their stuff. So, and the same thing happens to fuel lines. Quite often, long-term storage, they're stuffed. Not to mention the rubber components in here, the O-rings, invariably, it's got to be stripped. So the best thing you could do is make sure you undo the drains on the bottom of the bowls, completely let them dry, make sure they are dry. The fuel tank, make sure it's completely dry. Leave the cap off for 3-4 days a week to really get it dry. Make sure there's no fuel in the fuel lines or in the tap. Undo the drain on the tap. The difference is amazing, and I'd leave the tank dry, completely dry for long-term storage. It'll just save so much work and so much damage. So, and then I'd be covering the bike up. Now, we get a lot of bikes in Japan. They've got no storage area over there. They've got no spare room. They live in these tiny little boxes, and they don't have any outside, like garages or workshops. A lot of their bikes are stored outside, so out in the snow. So they get severely damaged and what have you, and rust, and yet they're all low-kilometre bikes, and they run really well, but they get a lot of damage. If they happen to be stored inside and they do the right thing, they're wonderful. They're like really good. In fact, I sold one to my brother, and it was a Suzuki 1981. He put it up there last year for judging, and it got 97 points. It had been stored for like 15 years. It had just been stored well. It was immaculate. So now the other side of it is retrieving them from storage if they're not done well, or even if they are done well, I guess. One, you check your tyres, and I don't like running on old tyres. They've got the little oval on the side with 4 numbers in them. Check the dates. The first 2 numbers are the week of the year it was built, so it could have been any number in there. That doesn't really matter. The last 2 are the important ones. It's the year. So check the year, and don't ride on old tyres. I'll be getting new ones. Invariably, master cylinders get stuck. Slave cylinders and master cylinders, the pistons get stuck. You quite often, occasionally you can free them up, but you might have to crack them apart, push them apart. Just clean all the gunk out. And generally, you don't need seals. Generally, they'll go back together and pop back in, and they work great. But, you know, if you don't clean them out, they're always dragging. They'll overheat. They're difficult to wheel the bike. It's just not nice to ride. So, you know, there's no dramas pulling them apart, pop the pistons out and clean them. But what also happens is the hydraulic lines, they'll clog up completely with brake fluid. And particularly on the ends where the swaging is, you know, where the steel fitting goes on the end, that swaging in there, the little hole through the centre there is the smallest, and that's where they block up. Now, you know, depending what the physical condition is, they don't normally break up internally and block the pipes. They don't normally do that. The ones we've opened up, cut apart, they look pretty good. But you can get in there with a wire and just get a wire around the bend, push them in, you'll clear them all out, and the things will work great again. But sometimes if you've got a restriction there, you can override it by pumping the fluid down, but it won't come back, and the brakes will be stuck on. So, you know, you can get in, just clean those little orifices out on those hydraulic brakes. Fork seals quite often go, you know, shortly after they're ridden, and that's just normal maintenance. Oh, and if you happen to have a hydraulic clutch, there's no different to the brakes. They lock up as well. In fact, probably even worse because the brake fluid's not moving down as the brakes were. It's always in the same place, moving up and down. And once again, now we get to the fuel. So invariably, when we get carburetors that have been stored, they're shocking. They get that bad that the throttle shaft seizes in there from the fuel. The chokes will freeze. Sometimes you can't even open the throttle. They're just stuck. The needles and seats are glued together with gunk, and you need to free all that up. That's apart from the bowls in there, which are just growing. Sometimes they're hideous. But we normally pull all the bowls off, and we use there's many different carburetor cleaners on the market, but by far the best one is made by Subaru for the cars, little silver pressure pack. It's unreal. It's by far the best. Others I've used, they don't even work. So, you know, quite often I'll fill the bowls up, let them sit there overnight, 24 hours, that's all you need, and put all the jets in, the needles and seats in, and they're shiny brass, brand new brass, ready to, you know, go. You'll still have to put a little wire up in the... I know people say, or the manufacturers tell you, don't put wire up through jets. What else are you going to do? Some of those jets, they vary from 10 thou to about 20 thou, depending on what size. What are you going to clean them with? There's not much can go in there. There's some of those tiny little brushes they use for cleaning teeth. They're a tiny little brush that I've noticed my wife using, and she's missing a couple. They're really small. They'll go into a lot of jets, but they won't go into the pilot jets. So I've got some tiny little wire. It measures 10 thou. Really soft little wire, and it goes in, and you can clean them out after you've soaked them and blow them out with compressed air, and you know, they're fine. And the wire doesn't hurt them because it's a soft wire, and you know, you go on it sensibly and carefully. You don't damage them. So there's the carbies, but the fuel lines. Sometimes the fuel lines are just rotten. Sometimes you have to replace them. But always clean them out and blow them out, because you get fuel lines that'll have a little loop in it, and that crap's sediments in the bottom there, and you might go and clean your carburetors, clean everything else, turn the fuel on, you push that crap straight down, straight into here. Next thing you know, needle and seats are leaking again. You wonder why. So you have to clean everything from the tank right through to the bottom of the carburetors, and you know, it's quite often missed because sometimes fuel lines disappear into bikes and you can't see them. You need to make sure they're clean. Very important. Fuel taps. Lots of the Japanese taps have got a little round diaphragm in them with a series of holes in them. Invariably, they shrink in size. You might clean them. You might say, yep, it looks perfect, but they're not fat enough to take up the clearance. So, you know, and you can't make them grow back again. There's people in the States now remaking those parts, and they're really good. They fit beautifully. A lot less heartache than trying to fill around or make some. I tried making them, and it's always unsuccessful in the long term. So, Air filters. Mice love building nests in air boxes. So quite often we'll pull an air box out and there's a beautiful nest in there. No mice left, of course, thankfully, but the stuff that gets in there, and mud wasps get into the exhaust, they get into little capillaries, they get in everywhere. So, little orifices like that you block up, I guess, if you can, for mud wasps. But mice in air boxes and mice up exhaust pipes is a common thing. I don't know how they get in the exhaust, but they do. So they put a nest in there, and you can't see it. You don't know till you can't start the bike, or if it does, you might be lucky to blow it out. But block it up with a rag or something before you store a bike, because not only that, it'll also stop humidity going in the exhaust and then sticking the exhaust valves stuck. So just something to check on. And always check the air boxes. Manifolds on particularly the Jap bikes, because the mainly English and American bikes don't have the rubber manifolds. But these rubber manifolds that are either side of here, where they go onto the engine and the one onto the airbox, the rubber components shrink, and they'll shrink surprisingly a lot. Sometimes if you take the carburetors off, sometimes it's super difficult to get them back on. And sometimes we've had to put new manifold rubbers on if you can get them. And not only do they shrink in diameter, but they also shrink in length. So I know on my GSX 1100, the manifold shrunk in length, the one at the back shrunk in length, and actually the airbox shrunk in length. So when I put it all back together and went to put the bolts back in on the back of the airbox, it was 15 millimetres short. That's how much some of the rubber components can shrink, and a combination of 1, 2 and the airbox can make a huge difference. And you're thinking, what am I doing wrong? You haven't done anything wrong. It's just old, and those rubber components just shrink. So, and quite often to get these back on, you've got to use a heat gun. Heat them up as soft as you can, and then they're that tight when they're old. Sometimes two people, we use 2 guys, bump them on together, so makes it a bit difficult. The other thing with rubber is the O-rings in these. And on this T-piece here, where the fuel supply comes in, sometimes they're in the centre there, sometimes there's 2 of them either side. Those O-rings always shrink and they leak. And if you overlook replacing those O-rings, you'll do it all up, put all the carbers back, turn the fuel on, you got another fuel leak. So these ones here, and in there, this bike here, this engine here has aluminium, so they're O-rings and you can pop them on. Some of the Jap bikes, a lot of Suzuki's, have a plastic, it's a moulded, it's T pieces metal, but the outside of it is moulded in one piece. No separate O-rings. There's nothing you can do with those. You either have to make a new 2-piece or buy a new piece. Suzuki don't sell them. They might sell them in the US, but if they're loose and wobbling, they will leak and they're a pain, So it's just something to be checked. The other thing is on these, where the needle and seat for the float, there's an O-ring around there as well. Some people forget to pull that seat out, and that O-ring always shrinks, particularly on Suzuki's, always shrinks. So you need to pull them out, put in a new O-ring so you feel a little bit of resistance going back in, because quite often when we pull them apart, they've been stored for a long time, those seats are loose and they rattle in there. They're held in by a little plate and a screw, but they rattle. So as soon as you put it back together, the fuel just runs around the outside. The needle and seat might be working, but the fuel just runs around the outside, overflows and all over the bike again. So there's quite a lot of things to chase up. And then whenever you're doing a job like that, you're going to need to do the balance the 4 carburetors, and then reset the mixture screws. So, but all of the components you never need to replace. You don't need a kit. All of the components other than the O-rings. We never put a kit through the carburetors, and look, I do 3 sets of these a week from long-term storage, and we never have a problem with any of the components. Just simply the rubber parts. That's all. It's the only bit that ever gives you any trouble. Diaphragms. I'd get 1 perforated diaphragm a year, and I know another mechanic. He just puts a little bit of tape on them, and they last for a long time. Or I use a rubber 3-bond to make a little black, a rubbery compound in a tube. It's fantastic. You can smear it on the diaphragm. It's flexible. It dries in 5 minutes, and it lasts forever. So it's a good thing repairing rubber damage and things like that. Then once you get it all back together, you do a compression test, or you can just simply put your finger over the spark plug hole. Sometimes you get sticking valves. Sometimes you get rust on the valve seats. Generally, if we get them with rust on the valve seats, you might get 1 or 2 cylinders that have been sitting with the valve open. You get atmosphere coming up the exhaust or atmosphere through the carburetors into the combustion chamber, and you get rust on the valve seats. We don't panic about that. Spray down the cylinders with inox or WD-40, just a bit of spray, a bit of lubrication initially to help spin it over. And then the other cylinders generally will fire the engine up. Once it's fired up and running, it'll knock the rust off the seats. I know the seats aren't going to be perfect, but very rarely do we have any that don't run fine and come up to good compression. So, you know, you don't need to go pulling the head off unnecessarily. Just get it running and it'll bash the rust off, and you know, they'll be fine. We never have a drama with those. Well, one a year out of many bikes, so never normally a problem. Electrical switches, as I said before, corrosion on the terminals and stuff like that. You know, as I say, you've just got to work your way through it. Quite often too, you know, where the wiring harnesses click together, you'll get corrosion in on those, even though they've been together, sitting for years. Sometimes you'll get a high resistance joint, you won't get the current running through, so quite often just click them apart, clean them, rub them. I've got a couple of special little diamond tip files to get into the female end. Clean them up and tap them back together. No problems there normally. Sometimes starter button switches and horn button switches are a bit of a specialty for that. Some of the starter motor switches run full current and they struggle with high resistance joints, but you'll find a little bit of use and they'll sort of start to come good. Occasionally we have to pull a starter motor apart, clean the brushes. Very rare, probably only 2 a year like that. And then when we get them running, we always just check the charge rate, make sure they're charging all right, and Bob's your uncle. So it's not that much in it. And so, any questions? It's made by Subaru for cars. It's a little silver pressure. I meant to bring it, but I've left it at home. Sorry. Little pressure pack about that tall, made by Subaru, and you buy it from the Subaru car dealerships. And it's brilliant stuff. It's really good. Yeah. Normally too, you know, sometimes we'll pull these out and you can't even move this throttle shaft. Can't move it at all. And you can't get the slides out sometimes. And if you go and force the slides up, you'll tear the circlips off the needles because the needle is glued to the needle jet. And sure, you can get in and force the slider, but you'll damage the circlip or damage the needle. So, but normally if they're in that situation, we just spray with that Subaru cleaner round here and spray it in on the needle and the needle jet and spray it on the throttle shafts. Let it come back every hour or so, give it another bit of a squirt. By the end of the day, that stuff's cleaned them up and you can open the throttles and pull the slides out and then start to clean them up. On the other thing for the needle jets, it's probably about a 3mm hole normally. What I use is, old-fashioned pipe cleaners you can buy from a tobacconist. And they're a thing about yay long, a little bit woolly, and they've got a little bit of like a very fine wire in there as like a bristle type brush. I dip it in that Subaru cleaner and then into the needle jets and just cleans them out beautifully. And even into the larger end of the main jets, you get in there and clean it out, and it's brilliant for a little brush to get in there and clean them out. So. Rust in tanks, yes, a very common problem. And for that residue, what I normally do is I fill the tank and I let it sit for 48 hours minimum, sometimes 3 days, with vinegar, white vinegar from the supermarket, and it'll eat the rust out. And then I get in and I pressure wash it inside the tank. Now, in most tanks, particularly the new ones, are really difficult because the filler neck lands on a piece there and you just can't get around the side. Old tanks are great. New ones are really difficult, but I get in with a pressure washer after I've soaked it for a few days with the vinegar, and I clean off what I can. I shake out the residue, and like tanks like that residue came out, it comes out in lumps, and I mean big lumps, and it's a hell of a mess. But once you can clean it out, you can get a lot out with a pressure washer, and so if you can make a little fitting with a bent end, you can get around the neck and spray it all around it. It makes a huge difference. And then I build a machine at work out of a little concrete mixer, a little concrete mixer with a 3-yard drum on it, and I put a timber platform on the front of that, and then we mount the fuel tanks onto that drum, and it tumbles over, and we call it grumble bum because it makes a hell of a noise. And we put in there, depending what the conditions like inside, some aren't really bad, they just some areas you can't get to. So I put in things like rice and let it tumble over and get to those areas. And then of course you've got to get it out, which is a hassle, but, it's what you've got to do. But the rice is good because it sort of gives us a bit of a sheen, a bit of a polish on the time, and it's a bit bit rough, and it knocks off some loose things. You get others that are seriously badly rusted, and I put in little pea gravel, like 10 millimetre gravel, like in concrete. The small stuff, they call it pea gravel, and you can buy it in smallish bags. And we put that in there and let that tumble over, and it knocks the rust off. And then you've got to keep changing the angle of where the drum's facing because it concentrates on certain areas in the tank. So we reposition the drum at all different angles so it gets everywhere around the tank. But in the end, it'll clean a really badly rusted tank out to its shiny steel. But then you've got to get the rocks out, and that can take you a couple of hours. And quite often too, the little crevices up the sides of the tank, some of those tiny little chips of the blue metal get stuck in there. So you got to bump the tank and bang the tank when you think it's got empty, and next thing you know, you got another 10 that have come free, and then you've got to get them out. It's a long process, but what else do you do? I mean, there is a method, there is a solvent, I've forgotten what it's called, that you can immerse the whole tank into. Doesn't hurt the paint. But, you buy a tank big enough for that, and if you're only doing one bike, it gets really expensive. So that's how we do them, and they go pretty well. Oil in the tank? You probably could. If I was going to be filling it up with something like that, I'd use kerosene. So, you'd probably fill the tank with kerosene. I reckon that'll be the best thing other than engine oil. But you could do that, yes. But most people don't think about doing it. To be honest, I'm no different. I've been crooked the last few years. I haven't been able to kickstart any of my bikes, and I didn't do the right thing, and now I'm working through them. But thankfully, mine don't have carburetors like this, and mine are pretty easy to do, But, But the bikes coming out of Japan, some people do it, and they do a great job. And the difference is massive. And and if they don't do it, it can be damaged quite often. I mean, we've had tanks ruined at work, ruined completely, rusted through. We've had other bikes stored out in the snow in Japan, and the frames are rusted through. I mean, right through. So, but that's an aggressive environment, but it's much worse than here. Sorry? Yep. Well, that's a bit hard to say because I don't know what they've put in them before. It just gentlemen's asking about different brake fluids and what have you. Harleys for years used .5. That's a silicon. That doesn't give a problem. The .3, .4 do, and they gum up and they clog everything up. The pistons will stick in. You'll pull the lever. The lever works fine, but the piston's not moving. It's stuck up the end and it won't come back. So. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep. Yep, on the seam. Yes. You could do it. It'd work all right. The other material you could use to seal a rusted tank is Need It or Devcon. but you know, it's not going to last as good as a metal patch. But Need It and Devcon have been used to fix tanks, yeah, and Araldite.
What about that stuff you put inside it?
Lining, tank liners. I use some tank liners, that white stuff. I used it in the 70s, and I've refused to use it since. And when I started at the shop I work for now, he wanted me to use it there, and I refused. Because I've never, and I don't know anybody who's ever had success with it. I could be wrong. Obviously, some people have had success. They've been selling it for 40 years. But what I use, I've got a vintage car, and there's another guy in our vintage car club, and he put me onto this red stuff, and it's American made, and it comes in a plastic bottle, red coat, and it comes in a plastic bottle, and you put acetone in it to soften the powder particles, and quite a bit of acetone, and it's I found it to be fantastic. And the instructions say on there, there's an importer is in Victoria, and you can buy it out of Victoria. The instructions in there don't even say, it says knock off the loose particles and what have you, and then dry it out with acetone to make sure it's completely dry, because the acetone dries really quickly, makes it dry quickly. And they don't even seem super concerned about getting massive amounts of rust and crap out, and they just say it seals over it and what have you. And I found it to be fantastic. The only thing is, because it's got the acetone in it, do not spill it on your paint. If you're doing a bike that's painted, be super, super careful. And I've had to do quite a few like that. But that's the only tank liner I'm willing to use as this red coat. So it's been wonderful stuff. And sometimes too, we've had tanks that you just cannot get another one. You can't get them. And I've put the red coat in there, the liner in there, and you can see little red pinpricks all over it where it's sealed the tank. And I'll give that a couple of coats, and then you can rub it back and repaint it, and they've saved them. So, but they're on the edge when they're like that, I can tell you. Yeah. I tried a bit of Need It on there, or there's some some of those epoxy ones that you mix up with two parts. So you can get some are runny, but others you can are malleable and it won't run and move, and they're good for sealing tanks. Oh yeah, put Vaseline in it. It doesn't stop it going off. Oh. You should be up here. Any other questions?
Could we just thank Bill, please, for this tech talk? Really knowledgeable fellow, and it's always great to have Bill along. Last year he did 2 completely different tech talks again, and he doesn't realise it, but next year he's going to be doing 2 new ones.
No, I'm not.
Good on you. Thanks, Bill.